Yes.
Yeah, so recording's happening too.
Yeah, and I've got the participant list so I can see, I think, as people join. I think I can.
Well, there's a photograph where Susan's image was. Do you have that?
Yeah, that's just her, whatever they call it, avatar
Okay.
image. So that's at Cape Sheridan. So the man beside her is Samson Simeone, who was our bear monitor on that project. So. Okay, so yes, people are coming in. So welcome to the people who are arriving. We'll get started in a few minutes once people have had a chance to join.
Most amazing. Follow me.
Hello, we're just letting people in and then we'll get started. Just give them another couple of minutes.
Mhm.
All right. Well, I suspect there may still be people joining late, but I think it's as good a time as any to start now. So good evening and welcome everyone to this conversation with photographer Shaun O'Boyle. I'm Genevieve Lemoyne, the curator of the Peary McMillan Arctic Museum, and it's my very great pleasure to welcome you all and to welcome our guest here this evening. I want to begin with a brief acknowledgement that I'm speaking to you from my office in the museum at Bowdoin College in Brunswick, Maine, which is in the traditional homeland of the Wabanaki, the people of the Dawnland, who are today comprised of the Maliseet, Mi'kmaq, Passamaquoddy, and Penobscot peoples. We are grateful for their ancient and ongoing stewardship of this land. For those of you who'd like to learn more about Wabanaki culture, I encourage you to visit the Bowdoin College Museum of Art's exhibit, Innovation and Resilience Across 3 Generations of Wabanaki Basket Making, curated by members of the Native American Students Association here at Bowdoin. It's on view in the museum now and until September 18th. And there's also a rich online element for those of you who want to explore the basket making traditions, but who can't make it to campus. Just before we get officially started, some organizational details. All of you, as you can probably tell, are muted. And so while you can see and hear us, we cannot see or hear you. We do want to encourage your participation, however. We'll begin things with a conversation between Shaun and me, but we'll then turn over to you for questions, which you can type into the chat function, which you'll see at the bottom of your screen. I can't guarantee that in the hour that we have, we'll get to all of them, but hopefully we can answer many of them. Other things, live captioning is on. So if you want a live transcript while we're speaking, you can turn that on with the live transcript button at the bottom of your screen. And finally, this event is being recorded and will be available in a few days from our website. So if you have friends who have missed the event, they'll still have an opportunity to see it. So for those of you who are on campus, you'll know already that we recently opened an exhibit of Shaun's photography called Portraits of Place, Arctic and Antarctica. It's in the foyer of Hubbard Hall. And if you've not had a chance to see it, I really encourage you to come in and spend some time with it. The photography is amazing. You'll get a chance to see some of it. I'm sure Shaun will share some of his images with us, but really seeing them in person brings it to a whole nother level. For those of you who can't visit in person, I will put a link to his webpage in the chat so you can explore his amazing body of work at your leisure afterwards. And there's a lot to explore. I have to say, it's really, you can spend a lot of time looking at some pretty amazing images and places. As we go through our conversation, we will of course talk about various aspects of Shaun's career this evening, but just by way of a brief introduction, I just want to let you know that this whole enterprise, this exhibit, and then this conversation got started way back in 2016. I went back through my emails and found the first contact that we'd had, Shaun, when you were applying for a second National Science Foundation Antarctic Artist and Writers Program grant. And so we've really been planning this exhibit since that time, since 2016. It would have happened much sooner, but for the pandemic, of course, and we're very happy that it's happening now. As we'll talk about, these NSF prestigious, very prestigious, difficult to get NSF grants and other grants that Shaun's received. He's been a Guggenheim Fellowship in Photography in 2017, for example. We'll talk about all of those things later this evening. His work has been featured in Smithsonian Magazine, in Lenswork, in Places Journal, among other things. He's exhibited at the Berkshire Museum, at the PRC Gallery in Boston, and of course at the very famous Peary McMillan Arctic Museum. In 2010, he published a book, Modern Ruins, Portraits of Place in the Mid-Atlantic region, with the Penn State University Press. And he's actually also prepared and published a series of beautiful limited edition books of his images. So you can explore all of that on his website as well. And as we'll be talking about, he's got other exciting projects in the works as well. And that's really all I want to say. I think now we can just jump right into the conversation. And Shaun, I know, because we were chatting about this a little bit just before we started, of course, the big news out of Antarctica is the Endurance. And that was the first thing I heard this morning when I woke up. And so have you been following that project?
That's pretty amazing news, actually, because they've been looking for that boat for years. And it's really difficult to get to the Weddell Sea because it's most often frozen solid. So getting in there and actually having time to search is pretty rare opportunity. So I was pretty amazed to see that.
Yeah, pretty amazing footage.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't know how much people know about the Endurance expedition, but part of the expedition was also located in the McMurdo region of Antarctica, because Shackleton was going to cross the continent of Antarctica via the South Pole, and there's a team, the Ross Sea Party was stationed in McMurdo, setting up food caches and basically waiting for Shackleton to arrive, which he never did because the ship was crushed in the sea ice. So
yeah, right. And that whole portion gets totally forgotten about, doesn't it? Those men never got any attention as far as I know. I mean,
you don't hear their story very often, and they really had some rough times there because the ship that brought them there was actually swept away during a storm, so they were stranded there for over a year. 2 members of the party were lost during that time, trying to cross the sea ice, and they disappeared, never to be found. So that's a whole different aspect of that expedition you don't hear about.
Yeah, it's really, I don't know, there's just, and then that I guess sort of leads me to the first kind of official question that I was going to ask you, which was, obviously you're very well versed in the history of exploration in Antarctica, and you've had 3 of these NSF artist in residence grants, which is remarkable. I know they're very hard to get. What was it that drew you to Antarctica in particular?
I guess a lot of the work I was doing, a lot of the different threads of my interest kind of came together for the proposals I put into the National Science Foundation. So a little background, I studied architecture in college. And actually before that, my father was a carpenter. So I used to work with him on all sorts of projects, weekend projects and summer projects. So I had a real sort of a background in construction and building and different kinds of structures. Ended up studying architecture in college. And in parallel with that, I started doing a lot of photography at around the end of my high school career, through college years and from then on. So so those interests were in place. And I think it was actually reading about the Endurance expedition was one of the first stories I had read about some of the exploration that went on down there. And then I started researching and looking into, you know, what was going on down there. When did these guys go? You know, and discovered there was an entire series of expeditions that went to the McMurdo region in Antarctica, attempted to go to the South Pole.
Yeah.
But also brought science down there for the first time and scientists. So so that's what got me interested in, and I started writing proposals for the NSF program, which it took me 3 tries to get into the program. It's quite competitive.
Yes, they're very competitive. Yeah.
So yeah, the 3rd try, I managed to spend 7 weeks at McMurdo Station.
Yeah.
And the whole region, visiting the 3 different expedition huts from Shackleton and Scott's 3 different expeditions that were in that area.
Mm-hmm.
So actually, I might want to show some photographs of that.
Oh, yes. Yeah. So, and it really was then the buildings that were the structures that were of interest.
It was the architecture that really captured my interest. Seeing some photographs of Scott's hut. This is a photograph of the Discovery Hut, which is right at McMurdo Station. This was photographed from McMurdo Science Station, so you can walk to the Discovery Hut.
Oh, yeah.
So this is the Hut Point Peninsula here, the very end of it. This cross you see here is a memorial to one of the members of Scott's Discovery expedition who was lost during some field work they were doing. It's called Vince's Cross.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll go through these fairly quickly because there's a few images here. Here's another picture of the Discovery Hut. So this is was actually an Australian prefabricated hut that they brought down here to use for storage, because during the Discovery expedition, they were actually living on the ship, which was frozen into the sea ice nearby.
Oh,
so they used this for storage and other odds and ends, but it was apparently too cold to live in there. It was a large space that was difficult to heat.
right. But do you know, one of the things Peary did, for instance, when he froze his ship in, was build huts on shore to store all the goods and supplies in case the ships got crushed. Was that part of their
reason? I think that was part of it. Yes. Yeah. Just to make room on ship to be able to live on board.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And they were in a protected bay, so they didn't see much sea ice pressure.
Yeah.
But subsequent seasons there kind of showed that was kind of a lucky thing, because usually that ice goes out each year. So they were lucky that they didn't get swept away.
Yeah.
So this is an interior of the Discovery Hut. This is an area where they kind of set up these storage boxes and some of the old sailcloth to allow an area to be heated inside.
Mm-hmm.
And this is sort of a homemade stove they have there that would burn steel blubber to try to warm the space up.
Yes.
So this got used during the Discovery expedition, but also in the following two expeditions, Shackleton's Nimrod expedition, and then Scott's second expedition, the Terra Nova expedition.
Okay.
They actually got used more then than it did during when it was first built. So there's another photograph of the area, and that's a sleeping pallet in the background there.
Right.
This I thought was interesting. I included this after I heard the news today. This was they used to sign the walls, and this was by Ernest Wild, who was one of the members of the Ross Sea Party during Shackleton's expedition.
Yeah.
He was here along with about 9 other people setting up food caches for Shackleton as he supposedly was going to cross the continent. This is Shackleton's hut at Cape Royds. This was a 1907 to 1909 expedition where he reached within 100 miles of the South Pole before being turned back by lack of food.
Which sounds familiar to all the people who followed Peary's expeditions.
Yes, similar problems. I mean, they basically starved themselves to get as far as they did, but they just didn't have the margin to go further and make it back.
Yeah.
And they were really very fortunate with weather to be able to make it back, because Scott tried the same thing and didn't have the same luck Shackleton did.
Yeah.
This is the interior of the Cape Royds hut with the coal burning stove and some of the sleeping pallets. They did have this all divided up during the expedition. So two people each had like a little cubicle divided by sailcloth.
Okay, yeah. The condition is remarkable. And I know people there've been the New Zealand, I think particularly, has done restoration on some of these, or
Right.
at least stabilization on some of these, but it must be remarkable to just be inside those spaces with that material.
Yeah, they're amazing spaces. And they do maintain the buildings.
Yeah.
In fact, I met one of the teams when I was at Cape Evans. And basically they just come in each year and make sure the hut is in good condition.
Yeah.
There's no leaks from weather, and they repair it.
Oh, yeah.
And I think they've curated the space somewhat as well with some of the artifacts. These are all original artifacts from the expedition.
Yeah.
And I think, they've arranged it a little differently than it was when they were first found after being left abandoned for 40 or 50 years.
Yeah, I can't believe that socks would have stayed hung up for all that time. But
Right, exactly. So this is Cape Evans hut here where Scott had his second expedition. That's Mount Erebus in the background. Another view of that with the Barn Glacier in the background. And that's actually a dive hut out on the sea ice used by scientists working under the ice.
Oh, yeah. It's wonderful how that you get a sense of the scale in that just, well, we were talking a little bit about scale before, but you can really see how vast the landscape is.
Yes.
When you've got a hut there to compare it to.
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, distance is very difficult to judge in the Antarctic because the air is so clear and there's nothing to scale with.
Yeah.
And it's led to a lot of problems for people trying to travel across the landscape. So this is the interior of that hut. This is the wardroom table and some of the bunks and the stove in the foreground.
Yeah.
The biologist's bench.
Yeah.
So there was, I think, 10 scientists in this expedition. So even though the South Pole was a big goal of the expedition, there were scientists here for several years working on their own projects. And it really established a baseline of scientific work in Antarctica that, continues today. This is another workbench. This is actually part of they had actually a very primitive telephone system between here and Hut Point, which is 15 miles away. They strung some aluminum cables across the ice.
Yeah.
And it worked pretty well apparently until the cable got frozen in the ice and stopped working.
Oh, right, yeah.
There's another photograph of the Mount Erebus with some clouds around it, lenticular clouds.
Yeah.
And then comparing that to the current science station, this is McMurdo from Arrival Heights area. So you can see that the station has really grown and it's become sort of a sprawl.
It really is like not even a small town, a medium-sized town.
Yeah, there's
Yeah.
about over 1,000 people here during the busy summer season.
Yeah.
So it gets, the blue building on the right is is where the cafeteria is, as well as some of the offices areas. You can't really see the dorms, but a lot of the area we're looking at here is just storage areas where they keep supplies that are needed in the field, because this is really the base where a lot of the deep field work is done. So flights coming in and out of here to support, deep field projects all over the continent.
Yeah, it's the real big hub, isn't it, of activity for.
Right, for the American program, the US program there.
Yeah. Yeah.
And this is a view of the McMurdo Sound from McMurdo Station, and that's another fish hut out on the sea ice there. And that's all I have for McMurdo.
Yeah. Well, it's wonderful, and yeah, one day I would love to get down there to see those structures. I think for me as an archaeologist, I think one of the things that I really love about your images is the way that they look at that intersection of a very challenging environment, human endeavors, people trying to do things, and then overlaying on that time and the impact of an environment over time and human activity over time. And it's not just these. I mean, as you said, the interiors of the huts and stuff are somewhat curated, although remarkably, I know they do it with a fairly light hand, but also some of your other images of your images from the, coal mining and Svalbard and things like that. And could you just talk a little bit about how that came to be such an important theme in your work, that sort of intersection of things?
Yeah. Time has definitely been sort of a central theme in my work, I think, from when I first started photography. I think one of the first projects I photographed was a farmhouse, which was actually three farmhouses right next to one another. One was the present one the family was living in. There was one a couple hundred yards away that was partially in ruin, which they had lived in previously. And then next to that, there was just a cellar hole. So it was an illustration of, this progression of the family over generations living on that same farmland. So that kind of time represented in the landscape and in architecture has been sort of a central interest of mine.
Yeah.
From that sort of subject to a lot of the industrial subjects I photographed, like Bethlehem Steel and other locations like that. So that was what drew me to the huts at McMurdo, was this connection with earlier history and all the literature that went along with those earlier explorations.
Yeah.
I started reading about that and became fascinated with the depth and complexity of what went into these expeditions. I think for me, it's a way of looking at the landscape as sort of a living history. You're actually touching and seeing the physical objects of history rather than reading about a version of history. So it's a different way of seeing, of seeing the past,
All right.
uh,
Yeah.
which is sort of illustrative of what actually happened in that place.
Yeah.
I find that aspect fascinating.
Yeah. And I think your photographs do an amazing job of communicating that. Just, it's really, it kind of gives, in some ways, it gives you a bit of a new way for, as an archaeologist, at least, a new way of looking at. I was struck by some of your photographs of Pyramiden, is that how you pronounce it, in Svalbard?
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
So this abandoned town that the Soviets, it was a Soviet coal mining town, and they just walked away from it, it looks like. And
Yeah.
so to see how over the years of neglect, they walked away in what, the 60s or 70s?
I think it was fine in the 90s, actually, when they
Oh, the
finally.
90s. Oh, really? Yeah.
But
So,
it's, yeah.
Even in that
Actually,
short time, yeah.
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 Actually, I have some photographs. I'll share it out again. I've got some.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Let's see here. Okay, so this is Svalbard here. I have some photographs of Pyramiden coming up pretty quick. But Svalbard is an interesting place. For my Guggenheim proposal, I proposed doing a project in the Arctic that was sort of a corollary to what I was doing in Antarctica. But much different because the history there is much different. Svalbard has a history of a much longer history from beginning back in the whaling days, when they would come to this region hunting for whales and walruses, and then it became more of polar bear and fox hunting. But eventually, the industry became mining. Mining for different minerals, gypsum and gold for one, for two, but coal became the primary mine. And there's a number of coal mines there, two still active today, but there was many more at one time. So this is the remains at Heelhortham, which is near Longyearbyen in Svalbard. This is an early mine right around the same time Scott was exploring Antarctica. This was going on in Svalbard. They had these cableways that went up the side of the mountain, and right up around here, there's a little dot. That's actually a large structure there where they had sleeping quarters and a kitchen, and the mine was right next to it. So this was an active mine for about 20 years. This is another mine number 5, was active until around the 1970s, I believe. But in Svalbard, the coal is mined from a very narrow seam. It's only about 3 feet high, and it's all the way up halfway up the mountain. So all the mines are in these really awkward places, and working in them was really difficult because they only had 3 feet of space to move around in while they were working the mine. So they basically skidded around on their backs while they were doing the mining.
Wow.
So this is a rail line leading up to the mine. Some of the hardware used for the cableways for transporting coal. This is like a balancing station, which would, with the counterweights, would keep the tension on the cables. But these sort of objects really interest me because, they tell this story in a physical way about the history in the area. This is mine 2B, another mine up on the side of the mountain. So there's many of these structures around Svalbard. From beginning about the turn of the 20th century right through the present day, there's been mining active here. The only time this place hasn't been active is during World War II, when it was actually bombed. This is getting near Pyramiden. The mountain on the upper left there is Pyramid Mountain, which has coal mines all the way through it. And this is the town itself of Pyramid. So this was a large settlement in Svalbard, supporting families and miners, and a pretty high quality of life from what I've understood. This is the rail line up to the mine. This is a central square in town, apparently with grass that was imported from the Ukraine. A lot of the miners in this area were from the Ukraine as well, and still are over in Barentsburg, which is another active town, not too far from here.
Okay.
Just a couple interiors of the coal miners' apartments and some of the, artifacts that they left behind.
Yeah, and that, as an archaeologist, it is so interesting to see what gets left behind, wondering why and how it's arranged. When you think of an archaeological, eventually it's going to be an archaeological site, and what you can learn about how sites deteriorate and how they get formed is really a whole nother level. There's so many interesting things going on in these photographs, but that, for me, that's one of them. It's just like that, envisioning kind of both the past and the future of a space like that.
Yeah, these spaces fascinate me because, it's a different culture, and, this was during the Soviet era of when this was active for the most part. So it's a peep into a different culture and a different time.
Yeah.
It's slowly being taken over by wildlife. The birds, when we were there, I was here with my daughter in July, and we spent a couple nights here. There are actually some caretakers here that watch over.
Oh, yeah.
And they take you out to look at the town, because you have to have a guide with you all the time because of the potential for polar bears in the area.
Yeah.
So we got to look around with a couple of guides here, and this is I don't know if you can really see it here, but this building, every vertical surface is covered with bird nests. All the windowsills and everything are covered with birds. So they're taking over the city again, and it's the 24 hours raucous noise of birds nesting. It's pretty incredible.
Yeah, it's just like somebody built a cliff just for them.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's amazing. One of the other things that has also really intrigued me about your work is actually the sort of parallel program where you've been documenting these abandoned historic sites, but you've also been documenting in a really interesting way the active science and the everyday life at places like McMurdo and the other research stations. And that the contrast is really interesting. And the content, just simply the content, is very interesting as well. But how do you see, I guess, a dialogue between those historic photographs and the contemporary photographs, the older early 19th centuries or early 20th century science and the contemporary, like very modern science that you're looking at?
It's that was part of my proposal for my Guggenheim, was to look, for the NSF, was to look at the historic huts compared to present day science stations, and draw comparisons if you could. It's difficult because the entire expedition was contained in basically one room during the early expeditions.
Yeah.
They had a few benches set up for science, whereas now there's an entire Crary lab with lab spaces and aquariums, and just an amazing facility at McMurdo. So it's just a massive change in scale.
Yeah.
Logistics, communication and transportation and technology just allows so much more than they could do back in the day of wooden sailing ships. The closest parallel I think I found was some of the field camps that I visited, which are sort of on the same scale as some of the historic huts.
Mhm.
But I do have some shots that I'd like to share for this as well. Let's see. So this is the Terra Nova hut, Scott's hut, and this is one of the science benches there. Just showing the they had very little space and they made full use of it. There was this was a chemist lab here. There was a meteorology section over here, and next to me here was the Ponting's Darkroom, which he had a fairly large space for doing the photography and film developing. This was a geologist's office, and bunk room. So there was three of the geologists were living in this space here. This is Ponting's Darkroom here, and he was central to the project because one of the things was being able to pay for the expedition afterwards, and a big part of that was showing photographs and films of the expedition afterwards. And then we jump to present day at the South Pole. This is Ice Cube Lab, which is a neutrino observatory and telescope. They're searching for particles streaming from black holes, here at the South Pole. So it's just a quantum leap in technology and the structures themselves. This is the lab here. So basically, this is like a large data center, and there's a cubic mile of sensors buried about 1 kilometer below the station in the ice. Because the ice here, the South Pole is at about 9,200 feet, and most of the elevation is ice. So there's a couple miles of ice underneath where we're standing here.
Right.
So they've buried sensors in the ice there. This is the dark sector lab, and they're scanning the cosmic microwave background with telescopes here. And this has been ongoing for a number of years. This is one of the telescopes here, and this is John Kovac. He's one of the Harvard people who's running the program down there. This is the inside of that same telescope. They're upgrading the telescope, so they're changing out some of the modules here for newer modules, more sensitive modules. So it's really fascinating to watch the process.
And this would be going on in the summer, but presumably there's people all winter there monitoring the equipment.
Right. So that's John Kovac again on the left, and he's training someone who's going to be a winter over at South Pole here for running the telescope.
Yeah.
So she would stay on for a year, through the Antarctic winter, when the South Pole station is isolated for 8 months.
Yeah.
You can't get in or out for 8 months. So there was a lot of work going on, upgrading equipment, rebuilding things. This was a refrigerator that brings the telescope sensor down to like minus 270 degrees. That's the South Pole station there. Another shot of that. So this is where everybody lives and eats for the duration of their overwinter.
Yeah.
And
Do you know how many people overwinter at South Pole?
I think for around 30 people,
Yeah.
30 to 35, yeah, at the South Pole.
So
More
not
like-
unlike a 19th century expedition.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if I could do it myself. That would be tough duty, I think.
Yeah.
I was there for a week, and I could have stayed longer, but I couldn't see staying an entire year. I think it'd be difficult.
Yeah. Yeah. They have to pick those people very carefully, I think.
Yeah. So this is a NOAA facility there, and they do weather monitoring, air quality monitoring. The cleanest air on Earth is at the South Pole. They have the lowest particle numbers in the air. And here, this is an instrument used for, what is it used for? I've got it written down here somewhere. Oh, it's for looking at the ozone hole.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
a photospectrometer. So we got to operate that, which was pretty cool. But because of some of the changes they made to CFCs, the ozone hole was shrinking and has almost disappeared at the South Pole, whereas it was huge at one time. Okay. So that is the end of those photographs.
Yeah, yeah, I mean, it's amazing to think of the parallels, the occasional parallels between 21st century science and early 20th century science. But
Yeah. I mean, I think you could say that they set a baseline for science and a work ethic and all that, but it's grown so much since then, it's difficult to make comparisons.
Yeah, really,
Yeah.
it's just interesting to imagine what they would think if they could come back and see
Yeah.
Antarctica. Yeah,
I mean, they were testing out these tractor vehicles that could just barely get through the snow, and they pretty much failed back then. It was just the beginning of the mechanical age.
Right. And even things like radio, maintaining communication.
Right. Would have made such a difference. Yeah.
It's incredible. Oh, something else I wanted to ask about, and I think people are always interested in, is what your working conditions are like when you're Svalbard in the summer. I think I can imagine it's probably like places I work in the Arctic in the summer, but being in Antarctica, especially at a place like South Pole where you're at such a high altitude, in addition to being so far south. Can you talk a little bit about how you do your work in those conditions? I mean, there's got to be technological challenges in addition to physical challenges.
It's a challenge for sure. I've got a few slides here of some of the clothing we wear. I arrived in October on my first visit, and the temperatures were in the minus teens to the minus 20s and 30s. This was a trip we took to Cape Evans, the first one. It's a 15-mile snowmobile drive across the sea ice. And it was especially cold that day. It was in the minus 30s with really heavy winds. And it was the coldest I've ever been, I think, up till then, and maybe since even, just because of the wind. And we were moving on the snowmobiles. This was a stop we made. So that's pretty typical Antarctic clothing there, all issued by the NSF. And, we're putting in chemical hand warmers in our gloves and stuff just because it was so cold. Just using the throttle on your snowmobile make your thumb freeze, so.
Yeah, just operating equipment must be, I mean, there must be times when you can't even really operate a camera.
Yeah. I mean, sometimes in the South Pole, it's not uncommon to have minus 100s during the winter, and they work out in it somehow for short periods.
Mm-hmm.
This is South Pole. This is the under ice tunnels where they run some of the utilities, and the ice here is a constant temperature here of minus 57 degrees Fahrenheit down here, which is the mean temperature at the pole.
Yeah.
So we were down here for about an hour, and I was amazed my camera gear continued to work. This is one of the escape stairwells, because we're about 70 feet below the surface here in the tunnels. And actually, there's some artwork down there. They've made some niches in the walls in the tunnels and set up. People have done different sculptures and stuff here, and this is the Buzz Aldrin niche with supposedly with a tissue that Buzz Aldrin sneezed into while he was at the South Pole, which he did visit. And this is the fuel arch where they store about 500,000 gallons of fuel to power the station during the 8 months that it's isolated.
Right.
And so these structures were built at the surface, but have since become buried because there's a constant drifting of snow there. So these are buried deeply in snow now, and there's tunnels going down into them to get access. But yeah, this is a food storage. This is the logistics arch. So they keep everything in deep freeze here for food that they don't need right away.
Right, yeah. Amazing. And I have just, we're starting to get questions in the chat. I have just one more question that I want to ask in case nobody else asks it in the chat. And that is, kind of the elephant in the room when anytime we're talking about polar regions, of course, is climate change. And we've, your work obviously deals with time and environment, and climate change is bound to be a big part of that. It's kind of natural outgrowth of your work. And can you talk a little bit? I know you've got some projects in the works that are dealing with that. Do you want to talk a little bit about those, and then we'll go to the questions that we're
Yeah. Currently I'm photographing in Iceland, some of the glaciers there for a project and an exhibition at the New York Hall of Science, which is scheduled for April 2023.
Oh, yeah.
So I'll be working on that project this summer, and I'm hoping to get to some other locations this year as well. Up north, possibly Canada, I'm not sure yet.
Yeah.
I'm going back to Iceland at the end of this month for another visit there. Do we have time to show any slides for that, or are we running short?
I think we could look at a few more slides and then we'll
Sure.
go to
I'll
questions.
throw a few here.
Yeah.
So this is one of the glaciers in the southeast of Iceland. And this is the glacial lagoon where the glacier is breaking up and there's a lot of icebergs breaking off. So this is a normal process in Iceland because it gets quite warm there in the summer, but this has been accelerating in a major way over the last couple decades, and especially the last 10 years or so. So this is an overhead view from about 400 feet up of some of the icebergs there. So these are very large chunks of ice. And these will just slowly melt and run into the ocean from here.
And they're floating in silty water, is that? Yeah.
Right, that's all silty water from the glaciers. And these pools are very deep because they've been excavated by the glacier itself.
Yeah.
So they're hundreds of feet deep. This is the Scofftafall Glacier here. And some of the crevasses, these are massive crevasses. This is also from about 400 feet up, looking down. So these are very large features. And some more icebergs in that lagoon. And just a couple more shots of glaciers. I'll be revisiting some of these next week. This was all photographed last September. So I'll be looking at a different season when I go there.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's gonna be great.
So yeah, the idea I think is just to give a visual sense of what climate change can look like in some places.
Yeah.
Places up north are being visibly hit by climate change, and you can see it. Whereas around here, it's more difficult to get a grasp of what it means.
Right.
Even though there is change happening, with the flooding and fires and the weather changes. But here you have a physical object where you can look at and see change.
Yeah, and certainly you talked about perhaps going to Canada, and I know that, I in my short career in the Arctic, there's changes that even I can see, and I'm sure the elders up there have documented a lot.
Yeah, I met a lot of people who have been in Svalbard, for example, for seasons where there's open water where even a few years ago they could cross it all winter on snowmobiles, now they can't.
Yeah.
So it's stranding polar bears on the shore and causing all sorts of problems for the wildlife.
Yeah, the bears, of course.
Yeah.
So, because I don't want to go too far over, so I'm going to try and ask these questions in the order that they came in, if I can. And so first, I think Jody Mason has asked, of all the places you photographed, what is your favorite and why?
Mm. I'd have, it's hard to say. I spent 7 weeks at McMurdo and I got to see so much there.
Yeah,
So that's certainly one of my favorite locations. I got to go via helicopter all over the region. I got to visit Cape Crozier, where the winter journey was made by Cherry Garrard. If anyone's read The Worst Journey in the World, they'll know about that location, in the dry valleys. So yeah, McMurdo, I think, probably one of my favorite places.
yeah. And now let's see. Andy Platt asks, he says, Shaun, you mentioned a farm and he wants to know who lived there, but he also wants to know, and I'll let you address this, are there any native populations in Antarctica? And if so, did they accompany the explorers?
Yeah, no, there's no native population in Antarctica at all.
Yeah.
It's the only continent on Earth that doesn't have any kind of native peoples. The farm, I'm not sure who the farm belonged to, actually. I could say a name, but I might be wrong, so I won't. A friend knew about it and brought me there, and we photographed it.
Oh, yeah.
But I've been thinking about going back there to see what it looks like now, because this was quite a while ago now, 40 years ago, maybe.
Oh, yeah. Maybe there's a whole nother new house.
There could be another new house there.
And let's see, John Bald has asked what kind of photographic equipment you take. Do you use lights or is it all natural light?
Mostly natural light. I bring a tripod. I use Sony camera equipment. They're A7R cameras, 1 through 4 I've brought to the cold, and they've all performed really well. I needed special permits to bring a tripod into the historic huts, but they gave me the permit, so I was able to use natural light mostly in those. I did use flash for a couple of corners, like the geologist little nook there, where it was just pitch black. Yeah, the camera equipment, I try to keep it small and compact because of the amount of traveling we do, and the weight restrictions of traveling there. So, a couple of camera bodies, some zoom lenses, and a few others. I think I brought 7 cameras on my first trip. Not sure how they would hold up. I wasn't sure if they would all fail from the cold, but everything worked fine. So I brought less recently.
And because I don't know Sony, I don't know camera technology. These are all digital cameras?
These are all digital, yeah, mirrorless cameras. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. When you think of when you were showing the picture of the darkroom, of Ponting's darkroom, and you think of his photography and, and
Well,
the
he
way
had the
we do
brain, yeah.
photography now. Yeah.
He was using huge view cameras,
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
take-
Glass plates. And,
yeah,
yeah.
right,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
And he was using hand cranked film cameras as
Yes.
well.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, we have, some of our northern material is glass plates and hand cranked films, and it's amazing that they took any pictures at all, really.
Yeah, yeah. But they did some amazing work. Yeah, they really did. There's actually a film Ponting made that's available to watch.
Yeah. And so Maureen is asking if you have any exhibits coming up. You mentioned the New York Hall of Science in
Right.
2023. Are there things after ours close? Are there others coming up?
Nothing this year. So that will be the next exhibition
Yeah.
coming up. It's in New York City and Queens,
Okay.
the New York Hall of Science.
Yeah.
And it's currently scheduled for April 2023, although they were recently shut down because of the hurricane last fall. It damaged the museum. They just reopened.
Yeah.
So it's kind of messed with their schedule, but currently I think we're still in the slot for April next year.
Yeah. That's fantastic. Are there any, I feel like I'm asking out into a full auditorium here. Are there any other questions? We're starting to run short on time, but I'm sure we can manage a few more questions. Oh, let's see. Oh, yes, no, that's John Bald's question. We talked a little bit about, in fact, I think one of ages and ages ago, I think when you first contacted me, you talked about hoping to see some of the similar relics in the Canadian Arctic or Greenland expedition huts. And I don't know, are you still hoping to do that at some point?
From the research I've done, I haven't found much that,
No, they don't survive as well. Yeah.
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 I mean, I thought about trying to getting up to Fort Conger, way up in,
Right.
Perry's hut there, but I don't think there's much left to it at this point anyway.
Yeah, it's been 3D laser scanned, so you can look at it.
I saw that. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
pretty amazing. Yeah,
Yeah.
so that's good that they did that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, most of my work, I think up there will be, if I find something, certainly we'll photograph it, but most of it will be related to the climate change project I'm working on now.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I'll be looking for glaciers to photograph.
Yeah.
I was looking to go to the Penny ice cap in that region up there.
Yeah.
On Baffin Island.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That would, yeah, because Baffin is really losing the ice caps. I think believe they're really shrinking.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, a couple of fellow Antarcticans had been up there a few years ago photographing in the national park near Pangnirtung.
Yeah.
So that looks like a promising area to possibly go for this project.
Yes. Yeah. Cool. Susan has asked about photographing in black and white versus photographing in color. I know some of with digital, of course, you can just make them black and white. Do you have a preference for?
Yeah, that's a question. Often the landscapes are very monochrome anyway.
Yeah.
In these regions, if it's not sunny out, it's very gray and very flat.
Yeah.
And I tend to think in black and white anyway. I started off with black and white film.
Yeah.
That's sort of my history.
Yeah.
But I will usually make a call if it's working really well in color. I'll go that way.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I do have a preference for black and white images, and just the monochrome tonality of black and white seems to work really well for these kind of environments with a lot of ice and snow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
You do often feel like even when you've taken a color image, it's a black and white image.
Yeah. And the tonal range there is pretty amazing because of, you have black volcanic soils and rock all the way up to bright white ice. So you really get a whole range of grays in there. So yeah.
Yeah, it's a fun element of the landscape to explore. I think we're almost out of time, so we've got two more questions. We'll go them quick. Jody, who asked what your favorite place would be, is now asking if you could photograph anywhere in the world, where would that be? Are there places you haven't been that you'd like to go?
I've been pretty fortunate with my travels. I've gotten to all 7 continents. And right now I'd like to get up to the northern Canada, up in that region.
Yeah.
That's an area I'd like to visit. And Alaska as well. I've never been to Alaska. So that would be one.
Yeah.
As far as exotic locations, my favorite place on earth is Antarctica. So getting back there, but it's really difficult and expensive to go there on your own.
Yeah.
And it's really, and I've been 3 times with the Antarctic program, the National Science Program, which is pretty unusual. So the chances of me getting another ticket down with them is pretty slim.
So we have one last question from Barbara Putnam. Hello, Barbara. I'm glad you're here. And Barbara is asked, she says, your work has been seen in exhibitions that are primarily in science institutions, and your composition sense and presence is pure art, she says. Have you approached art museums to show your work and spread your ideas?
I've tried. I haven't had much success there. And it's been difficult the last few years anyway, to get any kind of work out. Yeah, I mean, Bill Fox is at the Nevada Museum of Art, and he has some of my work in his archives there. Yeah, I'm making an effort to get it into a more art-oriented environment as well.
Yeah.
It is a tough thing to break into if you don't have connections in that world, which I don't really have. So if anyone is out there who does, please drop me a note.
Well, I certainly hope that that works out. And I hope you get up to Northern Canada. I know these last few years, it's been literally impossible to go up there, but I think that they're starting to open up now and it's becoming possible once again to travel to the Canadian North. So I hope that works out for you too. And on behalf of all of our silent attendees, I'd like to thank you very much for this enjoyable conversation and for showing us more of your photography. And I do invite everyone who can to come into Hubbard Hall and see the photographs in person. They're really amazing. And if not, then the website is also a great resource. And I would just plug our next talk, which is coming up in early April, which will be by Matthew Walls and Mary Kleist. Matt is at University of Calgary and Mary is at the University of Greenland. And they'll be talking about their archaeological research on some of the earliest occupants of Northwest Greenland and the implications that their occupations have for watercraft and things like kayak. So this is going to relate in many ways to our ongoing kayak exhibit. So thank you again, Shaun. And I will have more chances to talk with you and see more of your work.
Thank you. It's been great.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. And there are things coming up in the chat. I don't know, I'm sure you can check it and see.
Okay.
So, all right. So we will stop the recording and sign off.